For years, young women vanished along the quiet highways of Connecticut, disappearing without witnesses, without clues, and without answers, until investigators uncovered a chilling truth. The predator responsible wasn't a stranger passing through the night, but an ordinary man who lived among them, a college graduate, a delivery driver in the family egg business, quietly traveling the same roads as everyone else while hiding a dark secret that would eventually earn him a terrifying name in criminal history. Michael Ross, the man known as the Eggman. Tonight, we uncover the full story of how a seemingly normal life concealed one of the most disturbing serial crime cases in Connecticut history, and how investigators finally exposed the predator hiding in plain sight. Chapter 1: The Quiet Town and the Man No One Suspected. In the quiet corners of New England, there are towns that seem untouched by the darker edges of human nature. Places where the streets grow silent early in the evening, where neighbors greet one another by name, and where the rhythm of life moves at a calm and familiar pace. In the 1970s and early 1980s, the small communities scattered across eastern Connecticut felt like exactly that kind of place. Rolling farmland, narrow country roads, and dense patches of forest created a peaceful landscape that seemed far removed from the chaos of large cities. Families lived there for generations. College students attended nearby universities. Young people walked home after work shifts or classes without giving much thought to danger. For most residents, violent crime was something that happened somewhere else, far away, in places they saw only on television news. But beneath that quiet surface, a disturbing reality was slowly unfolding. For years, women began disappearing along the lonely highways and rural roads of Connecticut. Some were college students. Some were young women simply trying to get home. Others were hitchhikers hoping to catch a ride across short distances between towns. At first, the cases seemed unrelated, isolated tragedies scattered across time and geography. No one realized that they were connected, and certainly no one suspected that the person responsible was a man who appeared, from the outside, almost painfully ordinary. His name was Michael Ross. The people who knew him casually. Ross did not fit the image of a dangerous criminal. He was tall, somewhat quiet, and often described as socially awkward rather than threatening. He attended college. He held jobs. On the surface, he seemed like someone simply trying to find his place in the world, but appearances can be deeply deceptive. Michael Ross was born on July 26, 1959, in Brooklyn, New York, into a family that appeared respectable and stable. His father ran a successful poultry farm business, a large egg distribution company that supplied grocery stores and restaurants throughout the region. Because of this family business, Ross would later gain the strange nickname that investigators and journalists would remember, the Eggman. Eventually, the family moved from New York to Connecticut, where the egg business continued to thrive. To outsiders, the Ross family represented a classic story of hardworking success. The company provided financial stability, and Michael grew up surrounded by the resources that many families lacked. Yet behind closed doors, the environment inside the household was reportedly far more troubled. Years later, during psychological evaluations and legal proceedings, disturbing details about Ross's childhood would emerge. Reports described a deeply dysfunctional home life, filled with emotional instability and disturbing exposure to adult behavior far beyond what a child should experience. According to some accounts, Ross witnessed troubling situations that blurred the boundaries of normal development, leaving lasting psychological scars. Whether those early experiences directly contributed to the darkness that would later emerge remains a matter of debate among psychologists and criminologists. But what is clear is that by the time Ross reached adolescence, He was already struggling internally in ways that few people around him could see it on the outside. He was simply another student trying to navigate school, but inside, troubling fantasies and compulsions were quietly forming that as Ross grew older. Those internal struggles did not fade. Instead, they intensified that in high school. Classmates remembered him as intelligent but socially isolated. He wasn't known as particularly aggressive or disruptive. In fact, many described him as shy, someone who often seemed uncomfortable in social situations. That awkwardness created distance between Ross and his peers, leaving him increasingly alone with his thoughts. After finishing school, Ross eventually attended Cornell University, one of the most prestigious institutions in the United States. For his family, it was a moment of pride. Their son had made it into an Ivy League school, an achievement that suggested a bright and promising future. At Cornell, Ross studied agriculture, a path that seemed to align with his family's egg business. To professors and classmates, he appeared academically capable, if somewhat withdrawn. But during this time, investigators later learned Ross was already battling violent compulsions that he struggled to control. Years later, during interviews and court testimony, Ross would claim that he had been aware of these disturbing urges long before the crimes ever began. According to his own statements, he experienced overwhelming fantasies involving domination and control, impulses that frightened him even as he felt unable to escape them. What makes the story especially chilling is that Ross reportedly sought psychological help while at Cornell. At one point, he visited a campus counseling center and spoke about disturbing thoughts he was experiencing. But the full extent of those thoughts may never have been understood by those who tried to help him. The danger remained hidden. And after Ross graduated from Cornell in the early 1980s, that hidden danger would begin to surface in the most horrifying way. Once he returned to Connecticut, Ross became involved in the family business. The egg distribution company required frequent travel across rural roads and highways as deliveries were made to stores across the region. For Ross, this job meant long hours driving through isolated areas of the state. Places where traffic was sparse and witnesses were rare. It was the perfect environment for someone hunting for vulnerable victims. But at the time, no one saw it that way. To customers and employees, Ross was simply the son of the company owner, another worker helping manage the operations of a successful agricultural business. His daily routine appeared completely normal. Yet during those long drives across quiet highways, something inside him was beginning to break free. Across the countryside of eastern Connecticut, young women moved between towns, campuses, and workplaces, never imagining that somewhere on those same roads a predator was beginning to watch. The first signs of that predator would soon appear. First, it would look like a tragic disappearance, that a young woman gone without explanation. Then another, and another. Each case would leave families searching desperately for answers, while investigators struggled to understand whether these tragedies were connected at all. The truth, that a serial predator was already moving through their communities, would take years to fully emerge. And when it finally did, the realization would send shockwaves through the entire state. Because the man responsible was not some mysterious drifter or unknown criminal, he was someone who had been there all along, driving the quiet roads, watching, waiting, and preparing to begin a series of crimes that would eventually make Michael Ross one of the most notorious serial killers in the history of Connecticut. But in the early days, before the pattern became visible, before the name Eggman appeared in headlines, there were only unanswered questions. And somewhere in the darkness of those country roads, the first victim was about to encounter a man whose secrets no one yet understood. The peaceful image of Connecticut's quiet towns was about to be shattered, and the hunt for a killer had not even begun. By the early 1980s, Eastern Connecticut remained a region where daily life still carried the comforting rhythm of small-town America. Local diners opened before sunrise to serve truck drivers and farmers. College campuses buzzed quietly with students moving between lectures, libraries, and part-time jobs. On rural highways that cut through forests and farmland, traffic was often light, especially late at night. It was in this setting that the early pieces of a much darker story were slowly taking shape. For investigators, the first signs were so subtle that they barely registered at the time. Missing person reports were filed occasionally, but disappearances, especially involving young adults traveling between towns, were not unheard of. Sometimes people left voluntarily. Sometimes they were later found safe after unexpected delays. At first, there was no obvious pattern. Yet quietly, the pattern was already beginning. Michael Ross had settled back into Connecticut life after graduating from Cornell. His days often revolved around the family egg distribution business, which required constant travel along highways and secondary roads connecting towns across the state and into neighboring regions. This work allowed Ross to spend long hours alone behind the wheel of delivery trucks or personal vehicles, driving through isolated stretches of countryside. Those roads offered anonymity, and anonymity offered opportunity. Later investigations would reveal that Ross had begun acting on the violent fantasies that had haunted him for years. During police interrogations and court proceedings, Ross himself would eventually describe a growing inability to control his impulses. At first, he attempted to resist them, but resistance gradually turned into surrender. Ross later admitted that during his drives, he began actively looking for women who were alone, particularly those walking or hitchhiking along rural roads. In those days, hitchhiking was far more common than it is today. Many young people, especially students, saw it as a practical way to travel short distances between towns and campuses. For someone with Ross's intentions, this created a tragic vulnerability that a driver offering a ride might appear helpful, even reassuring. But the wrong driver could turn that brief moment of trust into a nightmare. And for Ross, that moment eventually arrived. In May of 1981, 19-year-old Wendy Barabalt, a young woman from Massachusetts, disappeared after being last seen hitchhiking in the area of Killingly, Connecticut. At the time, her disappearance did not immediately spark widespread alarm. Missing person cases often required time to investigate, and early leads were scarce. But for the family and friends who knew Wendy, the silence was terrifying. Days passed, then weeks, still no answers. Authorities searched the surrounding areas and attempted to retrace her last known movements. But the rural nature of the region made the investigation difficult. There were long stretches of road with few witnesses and little surveillance. Eventually, the case went cold, but Wendy Barabalt would later be recognized as the first known victim of Michael Ross. At the time, however, investigators had no reason to connect her disappearance to anything larger, and that lack of connection would allow Ross to continue. Over the following years, additional disappearances began to occur across Connecticut and neighboring areas. Young women vanished under circumstances that were disturbingly similar. Last seen traveling alone, often near roads where hitchhiking or walking was common. But again, each case appeared isolated. Law enforcement agencies across different towns handled their own investigations, and information sharing was not as rapid or centralized as it would become in later decades. This fragmentation made it difficult to recognize the pattern forming across the region. Meanwhile, Ross continued living what appeared to be a normal life. He interacted with customers through the egg business. He maintained contact with family members. He moved through everyday social environments without drawing suspicion to those around him. Nothing seemed unusual. Yet internally, Ross was descending further into a cycle of violence that he would later describe as compulsive. During later interviews, Ross claimed that after committing his first violent act, he experienced periods of intense guilt and self-loathing. He sometimes told investigators that he considered turning himself in, but those moments of regret were temporary. The urges would return, and when they did, Ross would once again find himself driving through quiet highways searching for another victim. The tragedy of serial crimes often lies in this cycle, a pattern where moments of normal life conceal deeply destructive behavior. For Ross, that contrast became more extreme as the years passed. On one hand, he was the son of a respected local business owner. On the other hand, he was becoming one of the most dangerous predators operating in the region. The communities of eastern Connecticut had no idea that this dual life existed. They still believed they lived in a place where serious violence was rare, but slowly, the number of unsolved cases was growing. Each missing woman left behind a family searching for answers. Parents waited for phone calls that never came. Friends held on to hope long after hope began to fade, and investigators faced the haunting possibility that something far worse might be happening than simple disappearances. Still, without clear evidence connecting the cases, the truth remained hidden. Ross continued to move freely through the same towns where his victims had once lived their ordinary lives, that he drove past the same schools, stores, and neighborhoods that everyone else did. He stood in line at businesses, that he spoke casually with people who had no reason to fear him. And all the while, the list of victims was quietly growing. What makes the early phase of the Michael Ross case particularly chilling is how invisible the threat remained for so long. Serial offenders often rely on that invisibility. They operate in the spaces between investigations, between jurisdictions, between moments when people realize something is terribly wrong. By the mid-1980s, that realization was finally beginning to take shape. Investigators were starting to notice similarities between several unsolved cases: young women, rural highways, disappearances without clear witnesses. Individually, each case remained a mystery, but together, they were forming the outline of something much more disturbing. Some detectives began to suspect that a single predator might be responsible, but identifying that predator would prove far more difficult than anyone expected. Because Michael Ross was not living on the fringes of society, he was living right in the middle of it. And while authorities struggled to connect the clues, Ross continued his routine, driving the same quiet roads where the first tragedies had already taken place. The peaceful image of Connecticut's countryside still appeared unchanged, but beneath that calm landscape, a dark pattern was slowly emerging. One that would soon force investigators to confront the terrifying possibility that a serial killer had been operating among them for years. And when the truth finally came to light, it would reveal just how long Michael Ross had managed to hide behind the ordinary face of everyday life. Chapter 2: The First Disappearances. As the early 1980s unfolded, life across eastern Connecticut continued to follow the quiet rhythm of small communities scattered among forests, farmland, and winding highways. College students traveled between campuses and nearby towns. Workers commuted along long rural routes before sunrise. Hitchhiking, though less common than in earlier decades, still remained an everyday sight along certain stretches of road. Most people believed these were safe places. The roads felt familiar. The towns felt connected. And danger, when it appeared in the news, usually came from far away. But slowly, something unsettling was beginning to form. One disappearance had already troubled investigators. When Wendy Barabalt, a 19-year-old young woman, vanished after hitchhiking near Killingly in 1981, authorities initially treated the case as they would many missing person investigations. Officers retraced her last known movements. They spoke with friends and family. They checked bus routes, nearby towns, and potential sightings. Yet the search produced very little. There were no clear witnesses who could confirm where she had gone after being seen on the roadside. No reliable description of a vehicle she may have entered. The countryside around Killingly stretched into miles of wooded terrain and quiet back roads, making it extremely difficult to determine where she might have traveled. Without strong leads, the investigation slowed. For Wendy's family, the uncertainty was agonizing. Days passed without answers. Weeks stretched into months. The silence grew heavier as time went on. But tragically, Wendy's disappearance would not remain an isolated mystery. Several years later, another young woman vanished under circumstances that seemed eerily familiar. In April of 1984, Deborah Smith, a college student attending Eastern Connecticut State University, disappeared while walking near the campus area in Willimantic. She had been seen earlier that evening, moving through town in what should have been a routine trip. Then she simply vanished. Once again, investigators began the search. Willimantic, though larger than some surrounding towns, still held the atmosphere of a close-knit community. News of Deborah's disappearance spread quickly among students and residents. Flyers appeared. Volunteers joined search efforts. Local law enforcement combed nearby areas hoping to uncover any trace of where she might have gone. But once again, the evidence was painfully limited, and no clear witnesses had seen what happened after she was last spotted walking along the road. No vehicle description, and no immediate signs of violence. TO investigators at the time, the two disappearances, separated by several years, did not yet form a clear pattern. Cases like these were often handled individually, especially when they occurred in different towns and jurisdictions. Still, something about Deborah Smith's disappearance felt unsettling. Some detectives quietly wondered if there could be a connection to earlier unsolved cases. But without proof, the possibility remained only speculation. Meanwhile, somewhere within those same communities, Michael Ross continued living a life that appeared outwardly ordinary. That he worked within his family's egg distribution business, traveling frequently between towns as part of the operation. The job required constant driving, moving products from farms and storage facilities to stores and markets across the region. For Ross, those hours on the road were more than just work. They were opportunity. Later confessions would reveal that during these drives, Ross often searched for isolated locations and vulnerable individuals. The quiet highways of Connecticut provided long stretches where encounters could happen quickly and disappear just as quickly. The environment itself worked in his favor: sparse traffic, minimal lighting, miles of forest and farmland where almost anything could remain hidden. And so the pattern continued. Another young woman disappeared, then another. Each case left families devastated and investigators struggling to understand what had happened. Some victims had been hitchhiking. Others had simply been walking alone when they vanished. The details were never identical, but certain similarities began to emerge. Young women traveling alone near roadways, last sightings occurring in rural or semi-rural areas, not a sudden disappearance with little immediate evidence. These cases accumulated through the mid-1980s. The sense of unease slowly began spreading through the communities affected. Students who once walked freely across campus areas started paying closer attention to their surroundings. Parents warned their children to avoid traveling alone at night. Hitchhiking, once considered relatively common, began to carry a new and frightening reputation. But even as public concern grew, the true scale of what was happening remained unclear. Law enforcement agencies were still dealing with the challenges of fragmented information. Different police departments handled separate investigations, and while communication did exist, it often lacked the centralized coordination that modern technology provides today. This meant that connecting multiple disappearances across different regions required time, persistence, and sometimes a degree of luck. And in the case of Michael Ross, that delay allowed the crimes to continue far longer than anyone would have imagined. Ross himself later described the strange duality of his life. During this period, by day, he interacted with customers and colleagues through the family business. He attended normal social gatherings. He moved through everyday situations without attracting suspicion. But beneath that surface, he carried the secret knowledge of what he had done. Psychologists who later studied the case often pointed to this dual existence as a common trait among serial offenders. The ability to compartmentalize, to separate ordinary life from violent behavior, allows them to blend into communities that might otherwise notice warning signs. Ross demonstrated that ability with disturbing effectiveness. For years, he managed to remain invisible to investigators, and during that time, the number of victims quietly increased. Eventually, however, the accumulation of unsolved cases began to demand closer examination. Detectives reviewing files noticed that several disappearances shared unsettling characteristics: young women, roadside travel, sudden vanishing without clear witnesses. Some investigators began asking a question that had not yet been fully considered. What if these were not separate crimes? What if they were the work of one person? The possibility was terrifying that if true, it meant a serial predator had been operating across Connecticut's quiet towns for years without being identified. But turning that suspicion into proof would require evidence, and evidence, so far, remained frustratingly scarce. Still, the idea of a connection continued to grow within investigative circles. Detectives began comparing timelines. They examined travel routes between towns. They looked at locations where victims had last been seen and tried to identify overlapping patterns. Slowly, piece by piece, a disturbing picture began forming. Someone was targeting young women along rural highways, someone who knew the roads well, someone who could move between towns without drawing attention. But even as investigators edged closer to recognizing the pattern, the identity of that person remained hidden. Michael Ross was still out there, still driving, still watching, and the investigation that would eventually reveal his crimes was only just beginning to take shape. By the mid-1980s, a quiet but growing sense of alarm was beginning to spread among investigators across parts of Connecticut. Individually, each disappearance had once seemed like a tragic but isolated event. A young woman missing, few witnesses, very little physical evidence. But as detectives reviewed older files and compared timelines, a disturbing pattern was becoming harder to ignore. The cases shared too many similarities. Most of the victims had been young women traveling alone. Several had been hitchhiking or walking along rural roads late in the evening or during nighttime hours. In each case, the disappearance happened quickly, leaving almost no trace of what had occurred. For law enforcement, these kinds of investigations were among the most difficult to solve. When a crime scene is unknown and witnesses are scarce, detectives are often forced to work backwards from fragments of information. A last sighting, a vague description, or a small detail that might connect one case to another. In the early stages of the investigation, those fragments seemed scattered and incomplete, but slowly, they began to form something resembling a pattern. Among the disappearances being examined was the case of Leslie Shelley, a 23-year-old woman who vanished in 1985 after leaving a shopping mall in eastern Connecticut. Her disappearance created immediate concern because she had been last seen in a populated area, making the sudden lack of information especially puzzling. When police began investigating, they discovered that Leslie had left the mall and was expected to return home later that evening. When she never arrived, her family quickly reported her missing. Search efforts began, But as with the earlier cases, evidence was extremely limited, and no clear witnesses had seen what happened after she left the mall. There was no immediate sign of a struggle. Her trail seemed to disappear almost instantly. For detectives who were already beginning to compare cases, Leslie's disappearance raised troubling questions. Could this be another victim of the same unknown offender? Or was it simply another tragic event that happened to resemble earlier cases? At the time, investigators still could not say for certain. Meanwhile, families across the region were growing increasingly frightened. News reports began highlighting the unsettling number of missing women in the area. Communities that once felt completely safe now carried an undercurrent of anxiety. Parents warned daughters to avoid walking alone at night. College campuses issued safety reminders. Some residents began wondering openly whether a dangerous predator might be moving through the region. Law enforcement, however, remained cautious in making such statements publicly. Without definitive proof linking the cases, declaring the presence of a serial offender could cause widespread panic. Still, behind the scenes, detectives were examining the possibility more seriously as they studied maps of the disappearances. A striking detail began to emerge. Many of the locations where victims had last been seen were connected by highways and rural roads that stretched across eastern Connecticut and into neighboring areas. These were not heavily populated routes. They were the kind of roads often traveled by truck drivers, delivery workers, and commuters moving between towns. Someone familiar with those roads could move through the region easily without attracting attention. Someone who drove frequently for work. Someone who knew the quieter stretches where witnesses were unlikely. But at this stage, investigators did not yet have a suspect who clearly fit that description. Michael Ross remained far from their radar. He continued living in the region, helping with the family egg distribution business that had given him his strange future nickname, the Eggman. The company's operations required deliveries across multiple towns, meaning Ross spent long hours driving through the same road networks that were appearing in investigators' case maps. He owed anyone observing him during those years. His routine appeared completely ordinary. He worked, he drove. He interacted with people who saw nothing alarming about him. Yet internally, according to later confessions, Ross was struggling with urges that had already resulted in multiple violent acts. During interviews, years later, Ross would claim that after each crime he experienced periods of intense psychological conflict. He sometimes believed he could stop himself from harming anyone again, but the cycle would return. The urges would grow stronger, and eventually, he would once again begin searching for another victim. What made the investigation even more complicated was the passage of time between some of the cases. Years separated certain disappearances, which made it harder to establish a continuous pattern. Serial offenders often commit crimes more frequently, creating clearer investigative links. Ross, however, did not always follow that pattern. There were gaps, periods where no confirmed crimes occurred. For investigators, those gaps made the connection between cases far less obvious. But despite the difficulties, detectives continued pushing forward. Some investigators began focusing on the geographic similarities between cases. If a single offender was responsible, he likely had strong familiarity with the region, perhaps through work that required travel between towns. This idea gradually gained traction that IT suggested the offender was not a transient stranger passing through. He was likely someone who lived locally, someone who blended into the daily life of the community, someone who could drive past investigators, families, and witnesses without anyone realizing who he truly was. For residents of eastern Connecticut, the idea was deeply unsettling that IT meant that the person responsible for multiple disappearances might be someone they encountered regularly, at stores, workplaces, or on the same roads they traveled each day. Meanwhile, the families of the missing women continued living with devastating uncertainty. Without answers, hope and fear existed side by side. Some relatives believed their loved ones might still be alive somewhere. Others feared the worst, but had no proof. That uncertainty created a long and painful waiting period that stretched across years. For law enforcement, solving these cases required a breakthrough, something that would finally connect the clues and reveal who was responsible. And eventually, that breakthrough would come, not through a single dramatic discovery, but through a combination of persistence, investigative cooperation, and the gradual realization that one man had been moving silently through the region for years, the man investigators would eventually identify as Michael Ross. But at this moment in the story, his identity remained hidden. The disappearances were still unsolved, and somewhere on the same quiet highways where the victims had once traveled, Ross continued driving, carrying with him the secret that would one day expose the full horror of what had been happening across Connecticut's peaceful towns. The investigation was slowly tightening, but the truth had not yet surfaced, and the predator responsible was still free. Chapter 3: A Predator in Plain Sight. By the mid-1980s, the quiet towns and rural roads of eastern Connecticut were no longer quite as peaceful as they had once seemed. The earlier disappearances had begun, leaving a shadow across communities that were not accustomed to living with fear. Parents reminded their daughters to avoid traveling alone late at night. College campuses issued warnings about walking by oneself after dark. Hitchhiking, once a routine sight along certain highways, was becoming increasingly rare. Something felt wrong, but what exactly that something was remained unclear. The problem investigators faced was both simple and deeply frustrating. They suspected a pattern, yet the evidence connecting the cases remained thin. Without a suspect, without witnesses who could identify a vehicle or a person, detectives were left working with fragments, timelines, last known locations, and the haunting absence of answers. Meanwhile, the man responsible continued living his life almost entirely unnoticed. Michael Ross blended into the world around him with an unsettling ease. Those who encountered him through the family egg distribution business saw nothing particularly alarming. Ross was not known for drawing attention to himself. If anything, he was often described as quiet and reserved, someone who did his work and avoided unnecessary conversation. For a predator attempting to hide among ordinary people, that kind of personality could be a powerful shield. Ross continued traveling long distances across Connecticut and neighboring states as part of the egg business. The work required deliveries and logistical trips that took him along highways stretching through rural communities, small towns, and college areas. Those same roads had appeared repeatedly in missing person investigations. Yet at the time, investigators had no reason to associate Ross with the cases that TO them. He was just another resident of the region. But internally, according to Ross's later confessions, the cycle of violence was continuing. That he would later describe how his urges operated almost like a storm building inside his mind. At first there would be tension, a growing sense of agitation that he struggled to explain even to himself. Over time that tension intensified until he began searching for a victim. Once the act was committed, the tension would briefly disappear. Then the cycle would begin again. Psychologists who later examined Ross would describe this pattern as a form of compulsive behavior often seen in certain violent offenders. While that explanation does not excuse the crimes, it helps investigators understand how someone could continue committing such acts while outwardly maintaining a normal life. And Ross was maintaining that life with disturbing effectiveness. He spoke with customers. He interacted with employees. He moved through everyday situations without raising suspicion. At times, He was even surrounded by people who had no idea they were in the presence of someone capable of extreme violence. This dual existence, ordinary worker by day, predator by night, allowed Ross to remain invisible while the investigation slowly struggled forward. One of the most troubling aspects of the case during this period was the geographical spread of the disappearances. Victims vanished in different towns, sometimes separated by dozens of miles. That distance made it difficult for local police departments to immediately recognize the possibility that the same individual could be responsible. Only later would detectives realize that the locations were connected by specific highway routes that someone traveling regularly for work might know very well. The same routes Ross was already driving. In 1984, the case of Deborah Smith, the Eastern Connecticut State University student who disappeared while walking near campus, remained unsolved. Her disappearance had deeply shaken the Willimantic community. Students who once walked freely between dormitories and downtown streets now traveled in groups. Despite searches and investigative efforts, authorities still lacked solid evidence explaining what had happened to her. Then came another tragedy. In the mid-1980s, a young woman named Tammy Rose, only 17 years old, vanished in the region after last being seen hitchhiking. Her disappearance carried the same eerie elements that investigators were beginning to recognize. A young woman alone near a roadway. A sudden disappearance. No witnesses who could clearly identify the person responsible. For detectives reviewing the case files, the similarities were becoming harder to ignore. Some investigators quietly began discussing the possibility that these crimes might be linked. But publicly declaring the presence of a serial offender required strong proof, something they still did not possess. And so the investigation continued carefully, methodically, as detectives attempted to build connections between the cases. While they searched for answers, Ross continued his routine. He drove the same roads, passed through the same towns, stopped at the same businesses. At times, he likely drove past locations where investigators were searching for clues related to the very crimes he had committed. It is one of the chilling realities of many serial cases. The offender often remains physically close to the investigation itself. Sometimes they even follow news reports about the crimes. Sometimes they revisit areas connected to their victims. Whether Ross did this regularly is difficult to know with certainty, but his continued travel through the region meant he remained constantly within the environment where the crimes had occurred. Meanwhile, the communities of Eastern Connecticut were slowly adjusting to a new sense of caution. Young women began avoiding certain roads. At night, friends accompanied one another when walking between locations. Local newspapers occasionally mentioned the unsolved cases, reminding readers that several disappearances remained unresolved. But few people yet understood the full scope of what had happened. The true number of victims was still unknown, and the man responsible was still living among them. As investigators continued comparing evidence, a new phase of the case was beginning to take shape. The possibility of a serial predator operating across the region was no longer just speculation whispered among detectives. It was becoming a theory that demanded serious attention. But identifying that predator would require a breakthrough, something that could finally connect the scattered pieces of information into a single, undeniable conclusion. That breakthrough would eventually come, but it would take time. And during that time, Michael Ross remained exactly what he appeared to be, an ordinary man, driving quiet highways, working in the family business, and hiding a series of crimes that would soon shock an entire state once the truth finally emerged. As the 1980s moved forward, the growing number of unsolved disappearances across parts of Connecticut began to attract deeper attention from investigators. Detectives reviewing the cases noticed that the similarities between them were becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Several victims had vanished near roadways. Several had been traveling alone. And in most cases, the disappearance happened quickly, leaving almost no immediate trace. While the public still lacked a clear understanding of what might be happening, law enforcement agencies were quietly beginning to examine the possibility that a single individual might be responsible. This realization marked an important turning point in the investigation. For years, the cases had been handled separately. Different towns, different police departments, and different investigative teams had each worked on their own missing person reports. But now, detectives were beginning to compare their findings more closely. And as they did, the connections became harder to ignore. The locations of the disappearances were particularly revealing. When investigators placed the cases on a map, many of them appeared along similar travel routes, highways and rural roads that connected multiple towns across eastern Connecticut. These were not the busiest routes in the state. They were quiet roads, often bordered by woods and farmland, where traffic could be sparse late at night. For someone looking to commit a crime without being seen, these areas offered disturbing advantages. Yet, even as investigators began recognizing the pattern, they still lacked the key element needed to solve the mystery. They had no suspect, no vehicle description that could be reliably confirmed, no eyewitness who could clearly identify the person responsible. Without those pieces, the investigation remained frustratingly incomplete. Meanwhile, Michael Ross continued living his life without attracting attention from authorities. He remained involved in the family egg distribution business, traveling regularly between towns as part of daily operations. Deliveries, logistics, and business responsibilities kept him on the road frequently, sometimes driving long distances across the same regions that were appearing in investigators' case files. Anyone observing him during those years, nothing about his routine seemed unusual. He was simply doing his job. Yet the very nature of that job gave him the freedom to move through the region in ways that few people would question. Delivery vehicles, business travel, and long hours on rural highways all fit naturally within the expectations of someone working in agricultural distribution. And because of this, Ross continued to blend into the background. At the same time, detectives were slowly expanding their investigative approach. Rather than examining each disappearance in isolation, they began looking at broader patterns, victim profiles, travel routes, and possible suspects who might have access to multiple locations across the region. One emerging theory suggested that the offender might be someone who worked on the road, someone who traveled frequently between towns, someone who knew the quieter stretches of highway where encounters could happen quickly. This theory made sense from a geographic perspective, but identifying who fit that description proved far more difficult. Hundreds of people in the region traveled regularly for work: truck drivers, delivery workers, construction employees, and service technicians who moved between towns daily. Any one of them could potentially have access to the areas where victims disappeared. Without stronger evidence, investigators could not narrow the list. Meanwhile, the families of the missing women continued waiting for answers. For them, time did not move the way it did for investigators reviewing case files. Every day carried the weight of uncertainty. Birthdays passed, holidays came and went. Some families held on to hope that their loved ones might still be alive somewhere, while others feared the worst but had no confirmation. That uncertainty created a kind of emotional limbo, a painful space between hope and grief that lasted for years. As the investigation continued, one thing became increasingly clear to detectives studying the cases. Whoever was responsible had managed to remain hidden for a long time. That meant the offender likely understood the environment very well, that he knew the roads, that he knew how to avoid attracting attention, and he knew how to disappear back into ordinary life. After each crime, This realization brought investigators closer to understanding the type of individual they were searching for. But the name Michael Ross had still not surfaced in the investigation, at least not yet. Ross himself later described the strange psychological divide that existed during this period. According to his statements during later legal proceedings, he sometimes felt as though he were living two entirely separate lives. One life was visible to the world around him. In that life, he was a worker in the family business, a son, a member of the local community. The other life existed entirely in secret. In that hidden world were the actions he knew he could never reveal. Acts that had already left multiple families searching desperately for answers. The ability to maintain that separation allowed Ross to continue operating without suspicion. But eventually, even the most carefully hidden secrets begin to leave traces. For the investigators working these cases, those traces were starting to form a clearer picture. They were beginning to understand that the offender was likely someone local, someone who moved through the same communities as the victims, someone who appeared ordinary enough to avoid raising suspicion. What they did not yet realize was just how close that person might be, because Michael Ross had already crossed paths with countless individuals who would later learn about the crimes. People who had spoken with him casually, people who had seen him at work, people who had no idea that the quiet man connected to the egg distribution business was secretly responsible for a series of tragedies stretching back years. The investigation was closing in. But the final piece, the moment when suspicion would finally land on Ross himself, had not yet arrived. For now, the predator remained hidden in plain sight, driving the same roads, passing through the same towns, and carrying a secret that investigators were slowly, steadily moving closer to uncovering. When that truth finally emerged, it would reveal that the man known locally for delivering eggs had been responsible for some of the most disturbing crimes the region had ever seen. But at this moment in the story, that revelation was still just beyond reach. The hunt for the Eggman was only beginning. Chapter 4. The Long Hunt for the Eggman. By the late 1980s, the quiet towns scattered across eastern Connecticut had begun living under a shadow they could no longer ignore. What once appeared to be isolated disappearances were now being discussed in a far more troubling context. Investigators reviewing the cases had started seeing patterns that were difficult to dismiss. Several young women had vanished under strikingly similar circumstances. Many had last been seen traveling alone along rural roads. Most of the disappearances occurred in areas connected by long stretches of highway and countryside, and in nearly every case, the trail seemed to vanish almost immediately. For law enforcement, the possibility that these cases were connected meant confronting a terrifying reality. Someone had been committing violent crimes across the region for years while remaining completely unidentified. But identifying that person would require patience, coordination, and careful investigation. The first major shift in the case came when detectives began strengthening communication between different police departments handling the disappearances. During earlier years, many of the cases had been investigated locally, with each department focusing on the evidence within its own jurisdiction. Now, however, investigators realized that solving the mystery would require looking at the bigger picture. Detectives started comparing files in greater detail. They mapped the last known locations of victims. They studied timelines and examined possible travel routes connecting those locations. Slowly, a pattern emerged that suggested the offender was someone who moved regularly through eastern Connecticut and neighboring areas, someone comfortable driving long distances, someone familiar with the quiet highways that connected small towns, farmland, and college communities. This theory made sense geographically, but it also introduced a frightening possibility. If the offender traveled frequently for work, he might appear completely normal to the people around him. He could be a truck driver, a delivery worker, a contractor or service employee. Moving between towns, someone who blended easily into everyday life. That meant investigators were not searching for a mysterious outsider. They were searching for someone already living among them. Meanwhile, the families of the missing women continued living through years of uncertainty. Without answers, their lives became defined by waiting. Waiting for updates, waiting for leads, waiting for the moment when someone might finally explain what had happened. The passage of time made the pain even more complicated. As months turned into years, the possibility that their loved ones might still be alive became harder to hold on to. Yet without proof, hope refused to disappear completely. For investigators, solving the case became not only a matter of justice, but also a matter of providing those families with the truth they had been denied for so long. Behind the scenes, detectives began expanding their investigative strategies. They examined records of individuals who frequently traveled through the regions connected to the disappearances. They looked into vehicles that might have been seen near the areas where victims were last spotted. They reviewed earlier reports that might have seemed unimportant at the time, but could now reveal new clues. These efforts were slow and methodical. Serial investigations often move this way, piecing together information from multiple sources until a clearer picture begins to form. But even as detectives worked steadily, the name Michael Ross still had not appeared prominently in the investigation. Ross continued his life as he always had. He remained involved in the family egg distribution business, a company that required constant transportation of goods between towns. Deliveries to grocery stores, restaurants, and markets meant traveling across large portions of the state to the outside world. Ross was simply part of a hard-working family business. Few people gave a second thought to the quiet man driving between towns as part of daily operations. Yet the very nature of his work placed him in exactly the kind of environment investigators were beginning to focus on: rural roads, frequent travel, unpredictable routes between communities. All of these elements fit the profile detectives were starting to build. Still, connecting Ross directly to the crimes required something investigators did not yet have: evidence. For years, the offender had managed to leave very little behind. Without witnesses or physical proof tying someone to the disappearances, identifying the perpetrator remained extraordinarily difficult. But as the investigation deepened, new information began surfacing. Some reports suggested that a particular vehicle had been seen near areas where victims disappeared. Other tips came from individuals who remembered encounters with drivers offering rides along the same rural highways investigators were studying. At first, these tips seemed vague. Witness memories were often uncertain, especially when years had passed. But collectively, they began pointing detectives in a more focused direction. The offender might not be a stranger passing through the region, that he might be someone who lived there permanently, someone whose work required constant travel, someone who could appear helpful when offering a ride to someone stranded along the roadside. And that description would eventually begin narrowing the field of possible suspects. Meanwhile, Michael Ross was continuing to live what appeared to be a completely ordinary life. He drove through the same towns where investigations were quietly unfolding. He passed the same highways that had become central to detectives' case maps. He interacted with people who had no idea that he was carrying secrets connected to multiple unsolved disappearances. What makes this period of the story particularly chilling is how close Ross was to the investigation itself without realizing it. The clues investigators were gathering were slowly moving toward him. The geographic patterns, the travel routes, the type of offender they believed they were searching for, all of it was beginning to align with the life Ross was living. But investigators still needed the final link, the piece of evidence or testimony that would transform suspicion into certainty. And when that moment finally arrived, it would begin unraveling the hidden life Ross had maintained for so many years. The man who had blended so easily into everyday life would soon face questions that could no longer be avoided. The quiet predator moving through Connecticut's highways was about to be exposed. But the breakthrough that would lead detectives directly to Michael Ross was still just ahead. And when it came, it would reveal that the truth had been hiding much closer than anyone expected. As investigators moved deeper into their efforts to connect the growing number of disappearances across eastern Connecticut, the investigation began shifting into a new and more focused phase. Detectives were no longer simply reviewing individual cases. They were building a broader picture of how the crimes might have occurred and who might have been responsible. One of the most important developments during this stage of the investigation was the increasing recognition that the offender likely had a very specific relationship with the geography of the region. The crimes were not random in location. They followed a pattern of roads and travel corridors connecting several towns. These routes passed through quiet areas where traffic was often light, especially during nighttime hours. Long stretches of forest and farmland meant there were few witnesses, and many parts of these roads remained poorly lit after dark. For someone familiar with the area, these conditions created an environment where encounters could happen quickly and disappear just as quickly. Investigators began studying these roadways in greater detail. They examined where victims had last been seen. They looked at how those locations connected to nearby highways. They considered how someone traveling through the region regularly might move between those areas without attracting attention. This geographic analysis slowly strengthened one of the central theories emerging within the investigation. The offender was likely someone whose job required frequent driving, someone who moved between towns as part of their daily routine, someone who could travel across the same roads repeatedly without raising suspicion. This profile immediately pointed investigators towards certain types of occupations: delivery, drivers, service technicians, truck operators, and others whose work involved regular travel. But even with that narrowing of focus, the list of possible suspects remained large. Hundreds of individuals in the region traveled between towns for work. Finding the right person among them would require patience and persistence. Meanwhile, the families of the missing women continued living through the painful uncertainty that had already lasted for years. Some had tried to maintain hope, believing that one day their loved ones might return or be found alive somewhere. But as time passed, that hope became harder to hold on to. Many families began preparing themselves for the possibility that the truth would be far more tragic. For investigators, solving the case meant more than simply identifying a suspect. It meant providing those families with answers they had waited for far too long. AS detectives continued reviewing the cases. Another important development began to emerge. Information from earlier investigations was being re-examined. Witness statements that once seemed too vague or uncertain were now being reconsidered in light of the new understanding that the crimes might be connected. Among these statements were accounts from individuals who remembered encounters with drivers offering rides along certain roads where victims had disappeared. In some cases, the drivers were described only briefly: a vehicle slowing down, a conversation lasting only moments before the person offering the ride drove away. But collectively, these memories began reinforcing the theory investigators were developing. The offender likely approached victims while driving, that he likely appeared normal enough to avoid raising immediate suspicion, and he likely knew the area well enough to disappear quickly afterward. This picture was becoming clearer, but one final piece was still missing. Investigators needed something that could tie a specific individual to one of the crimes. That breakthrough eventually came when law enforcement received information linking a particular vehicle and driver to one of the disappearance cases. The lead was not dramatic or immediate. It was the result of careful investigative work, comparing statements, reviewing timelines, and following up on small details that had previously gone unnoticed. But when detectives began examining this lead more closely, it pointed them towards someone whose life fit many of the patterns they had been studying. That person was Michael Ross. At first, Ross did not immediately stand out as an obvious suspect. He had no highly visible criminal reputation. He lived a life that appeared relatively ordinary. But as investigators began examining his background more carefully, several details caught their attention. Ross worked within his family's egg distribution business, a job that required constant travel across the very regions where the disappearances had occurred. He regularly drove through rural highways connecting towns like those appearing in investigators' case maps, and his schedule gave him the flexibility to be on the road during the times when several victims were last seen. This alone did not prove guilt, but it made Ross someone detectives needed to examine more closely. Investigators began quietly gathering more information about him. They reviewed his travel patterns. They looked into his connections to areas where victims had disappeared. They examined any possible links between Ross and the individuals who had gone missing. As they did, the possibility that Ross might be connected to the crimes grew stronger. For detectives who had spent years searching for answers, this moment represented the first real chance that they might finally be closing in on the person responsible. But confirming their suspicions required careful handling. That if Ross was indeed the offender, investigators needed evidence strong enough to withstand the scrutiny of the justice system. They could not rush. They needed to build a case that would reveal the truth clearly and convincingly. Meanwhile, Ross himself continued living his life without knowing how close investigators were coming to uncovering his secret. He drove the same roads, worked within the family business, spoke with people who had no idea that detectives were beginning to look at him as a possible suspect. But the investigation had entered a new stage. The pattern that had once been hidden among scattered disappearances was now guiding detectives toward a specific individual. The quiet man connected to the egg distribution business was no longer just another resident of the region. He was becoming the central focus of one of the most disturbing criminal investigations Connecticut had ever faced, and soon, investigators would confront him directly when that moment came. The hidden life Michael Ross had maintained for so long would begin to collapse. The man known locally for delivering eggs would soon be revealed as something far more sinister. The hunt for the eggman was reaching its most critical moment. Chapter 5: Confession and the Chilling Truth. By the time investigators began focusing their attention on Michael Ross, the investigation had already stretched across years of unanswered questions. Detectives had studied maps, compared files, interviewed witnesses, and examined the unsettling similarities between multiple disappearances. Slowly, piece by piece, the puzzle had begun pointing toward a man whose life seemed deeply connected to the same roads and regions where the victims had vanished. Yet suspicion alone was not enough. For law enforcement, confronting a suspect in a case of this magnitude required careful planning. The crimes investigators believed they were dealing with were extremely serious, and the possibility that Ross might be responsible for multiple violent acts meant the situation had to be handled cautiously. Before approaching him directly, detectives gathered as much information as possible about his routines and movements. They examined his work schedule within the family egg distribution business, noting the frequent travel it required across eastern Connecticut and neighboring areas. They looked at how those routes overlapped with locations where victims had last been seen. The overlap was difficult to ignore that Ross's job placed him regularly on the same highways investigators had already identified as central to the pattern of disappearances. Long stretches of road connected the towns involved in the cases, routes Ross had likely driven countless times as part of his work. Still, investigators needed more. They needed something that could link Ross directly to one of the victims or to one of the locations connected to the crimes. As detectives continued their work, they began quietly gathering statements and reviewing older reports that had once seemed too uncertain to pursue further. Some witnesses remembered brief encounters with drivers offering rides along roads where victims had disappeared. Others recalled seeing unfamiliar vehicles near certain locations. Individually, these memories remained incomplete, but when examined together, they began strengthening the possibility that investigators were looking in the right direction. Eventually, law enforcement reached the point where they needed to speak with Ross directly. The decision to bring him in for questioning marked a turning point in the entire investigation. For years, the offender behind the disappearances had remained a shadow, someone who existed only through clues, theories, and patterns. Now detectives were preparing to confront a real person who might hold the answers they had been searching for. When Ross was approached by investigators, he initially appeared calm. People who later studied the case often remarked on how ordinary Ross seemed during those early interactions with law enforcement. He did not immediately display the panic or aggression that some suspects show when confronted by police. Instead, he appeared quiet, composed, and cooperative. At first, the conversation focused on routine questions: his work, his travel routes, and his familiarity with the areas where several victims had disappeared. Ross answered these questions without visible resistance. But detectives were carefully observing his reactions. Investigators trained in interrogation techniques often look for subtle shifts in behavior, moments when a suspect's responses become hesitant, inconsistent, or overly cautious. As the questioning continued, detectives began asking more direct questions about specific cases, about the young women who had disappeared, about the roads where they were last seen, about whether Ross had ever encountered hitchhikers while driving through those areas. For someone whose work involved frequent travel, such encounters would not have been unusual. Drivers often passed hitchhikers along rural roads during that era. But what mattered to investigators was how Ross responded when those topics were raised. First, he offered general answers, the kind of responses someone might give when recalling ordinary experiences from years earlier. Yet as the conversation continued, something began to change. Detectives noticed moments where Ross seemed to struggle with his responses, small pauses, shifts in tone, answers that seemed incomplete or uncertain for experienced investigators. These moments could signal that the suspect was beginning to feel the pressure of the situation. Interrogations often unfold gradually. Rather than confronting a suspect immediately with accusations, detectives may guide the conversation step by step, allowing tension to build. And in Ross's case, that tension eventually reached a breaking point. During the questioning, Ross began revealing details that immediately captured investigators' attention. Some of the information he provided appeared to relate directly to the cases detectives had been investigating, details that had not been widely known to the public, details that suggested Ross might know far more about the disappearances than he should. For investigators who had spent years searching for answers, this moment was extraordinary. The quiet man sitting across from them was beginning to reveal the truth. And that truth was darker than anyone had hoped. As the interrogation continued, Ross eventually began admitting involvement in several of the disappearances. His statements described encounters with young women along rural highways. He spoke about offering rides to hitchhikers, and he acknowledged that those encounters had sometimes ended in violence. For detectives listening to these admissions, the realization was both shocking and deeply sobering. The man they had been questioning was not simply someone who knew about the crimes, he was the person responsible, the predator who had been operating across Connecticut's highways for years, the man who would later become known in media reports as the Eggman. Ross's admissions began revealing the scale of what had happened. The disappearances investigators had spent years trying to connect were indeed part of a single pattern. Multiple victims, multiple locations, that a series of crimes committed over several years by someone who had hidden in plain sight. Yet even as Ross began confessing, the investigation was far from over. Each admission had to be carefully documented. Each claim had to be verified through evidence and investigation. Detectives needed to confirm the details Ross was providing, both to ensure accuracy and to build a case strong enough to bring justice for the victims. But one thing was already clear. The mystery that had haunted eastern Connecticut for years was finally beginning to unravel. The man responsible for the disappearances had been identified, and the full truth of what Michael Ross had done was about to emerge. As Michael Ross continued speaking with investigators, the atmosphere inside the interrogation room changed dramatically. What had begun as a cautious conversation with a potential suspect was now becoming something far more serious. Ross was no longer simply answering questions, he was admitting responsibility. For detectives who had spent years reviewing missing person reports and searching for connections between seemingly unrelated cases, the moment carried enormous weight. The man seated across from them was beginning to confirm what many investigators had only suspected. The disappearances were not isolated. They were the work of a single individual. And that individual was Michael Ross. As the interrogation progressed, Ross began describing encounters that had taken place along the same rural highways investigators had been studying for years. Many of the victims had been hitchhiking or walking alone when Ross encountered them. According to his statements, he often approached them while driving and offered a ride. For someone standing beside a quiet highway late at night, a driver offering help could appear reassuring. Many young travelers during that time relied on rides from passing vehicles to reach nearby towns or campuses. Ross understood this vulnerability, and he used it to his advantage. Once the victims entered his vehicle, Ross explained, the situation would change. What began as a simple offer of transportation would become something far darker. During the interrogation, Ross described how he would drive away from populated areas and into more isolated locations. These quiet roads and wooded areas were places he knew well from years of traveling through the region as part of the family egg business. For investigators listening to these details, the geographic patterns they had identified earlier suddenly made complete sense. The offender had known the region intimately. He had understood exactly where he could travel without being seen. And he had used that knowledge repeatedly. Ross's statements began confirming the fates of several women whose families had spent years searching for answers. Among the victims he confessed to harming were Wendy Barabalt, Deborah Smith, Leslie Shelley, Tammy Rose, and others whose disappearances had troubled investigators across Connecticut and neighboring areas. Each confession brought painful clarity. For the families of the victims, these revelations would eventually bring both devastating grief and long-awaited answers. The uncertainty that had lasted for years, the terrible question of what had happened, was finally being replaced by the truth. But the truth itself was deeply difficult to confront. Ross acknowledged that the crimes had taken place over several years, stretching from the early 1980s into the mid-1980s. During that time, he had continued living his life in a way that allowed him to blend into everyday society. He worked, he traveled, he interacted with people who never suspected the violent acts he had committed. The contrast between his outward life and his hidden crimes would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Psychologists and criminologists who later studied Ross often described his ability to maintain this double life as a form of compartmentalization, the mental separation between ordinary behavior and deeply destructive impulses. According to Ross's own statements, he experienced cycles of tension and guilt following each crime. At times, he believed he could control his urges and avoid harming anyone again. But eventually, those urges returned, and when they did, Ross would once again begin searching for another victim. For investigators, confirming Ross's admissions required careful verification. Confessions alone were not enough. Detectives needed evidence that could support the details Ross provided. This meant examining locations he described, reviewing timelines, and comparing his statements with information gathered during earlier investigations that in many cases, Ross's descriptions aligned closely with facts already known to investigators. Locations matched, dates matched, certain details about the victims matched information that had never been released publicly. These confirmations strengthened the case against him. As Ross continued speaking, detectives began realizing that the man before them had been responsible for a series of crimes far more extensive than anyone had initially imagined. The disappearances that had puzzled investigators for years were now part of a single narrative, one that stretched across highways, towns, and multiple communities. The quiet predator they had been searching for had finally been identified, but the investigation was not yet finished. Even after Ross's admissions, detectives needed to reconstruct the full timeline of his actions. They needed to understand exactly when each crime occurred, where it happened, and how the events unfolded. This process required many hours of interviews and follow-up investigation. Meanwhile, news of Ross's arrest and confessions began spreading through the communities affected by the disappearances. For residents of eastern Connecticut, the revelation was shocking. The man responsible for the crimes was not an unknown stranger passing through the region. He was someone who had lived and worked among them, someone who had driven the same roads they traveled every day, someone who appeared, from the outside, completely ordinary. This realization created a profound sense of unease. People began wondering how someone could hide such actions for so long without being discovered. The answer, investigators explained, often lies in the ordinary nature of the offender's life. Serial offenders frequently rely on the fact that they do not appear suspicious. They work regular jobs. They interact with others normally. They move through society without drawing attention. Michael Ross had done exactly that. But now the truth had emerged. The man known locally for his connection to the egg distribution business had been revealed as the person responsible for multiple violent crimes. The years of uncertainty surrounding the disappearances were finally ending. Yet for the families of the victims, the emotional journey was only beginning. Learning the truth brought answers, but those answers also carried the painful confirmation of what had happened to their loved ones. The investigation that had taken years to unfold was now entering its final stages, and soon, the focus would shift from uncovering the truth to seeking justice in the courtroom. Chapter 6. Inside the Mind of Michael Ross. After Michael Ross's confessions began revealing the truth behind years of disappearances, the investigation entered a new and complex phase. Detectives had spent years trying to identify the person responsible for the crimes. Now that they had him in custody, the focus shifted toward understanding not only what had happened, but why. For prosecutors preparing the case and for investigators seeking to understand the full picture, Ross's psychological state became an important area of examination. Cases involving serial offenders often raise difficult questions about the inner world of the person responsible. What kind of thoughts led them down such a path? Were there warning signs earlier in life? Could the behavior have been prevented if those signs had been recognized? To explore these questions, psychological experts began examining Ross's background in detail. They looked at his childhood, his family environment, his early behavior, and the personal struggles he later described during interviews and legal proceedings. From the outside, Ross's early life had appeared relatively stable, that he was born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1959 before his family eventually moved to Connecticut. His father operated a successful egg distribution business that supplied food products to grocery stores and restaurants throughout the region. The business created financial stability for the family, and from a distance their life seemed comfortable. But as investigators and psychologists later examined Ross's history, a more complicated picture began to emerge. During interviews conducted after his arrest, Ross spoke about troubling experiences during his childhood that he believed had affected his development. Some of these accounts suggested that the environment inside the household may have exposed him to situations that were deeply confusing and harmful for a young child. Psychologists evaluating Ross later noted that such experiences can sometimes have long-lasting psychological effects. Exposure to inappropriate or disturbing situations at an early age can shape a person's emotional development in ways that may not fully surface until much later in life. However, experts were careful to emphasize that childhood trauma alone does not determine someone's future behavior. Many individuals experience difficult childhoods without ever committing violent acts. Understanding Ross's background was not about excusing the crimes that it was about understanding how the psychological path toward those crimes may have developed. As Ross grew older, some signs of emotional difficulty appeared. During his school years, he was often described as intelligent but socially awkward. Classmates later remembered him as someone who seemed quiet and somewhat isolated. He was not known as a troublemaker or someone who caused problems in school. Instead, he often kept to himself. That isolation may have allowed certain troubling thoughts to develop without anyone around him recognizing the warning signs. By the time Ross entered adolescence, he later claimed that he was already experiencing disturbing fantasies involving domination and control. These thoughts frightened him, but he also described feeling unable to completely escape them. For many years, these internal struggles remained hidden. Outwardly, Ross continued moving through life in ways that appeared successful. After graduating from high school, he was accepted into Cornell University, one of the most respected universities in the United States. For his family, this was a significant achievement and a moment of pride. At Cornell, Ross studied agriculture, a choice that aligned naturally with the family egg distribution business he would eventually help manage. From an academic perspective, Ross performed well, but internally, according to later statements, he was still struggling with thoughts he did not fully understand. During his time at Cornell, Ross reportedly sought help from a university counseling service. He spoke with professionals about disturbing urges he was experiencing and expressed concern about his inability to control them at the time. However, it appears that the full severity of these thoughts was not fully recognized. Counseling services often deal with a wide range of psychological concerns, and without clear evidence that someone intends to harm others, identifying the potential for future violence can be extremely difficult. Ross eventually graduated and returned to Connecticut, where he became more involved in the family egg distribution business. From the outside, this period of his life looked stable, that he had completed college, that he had employment, he had a role within the family business. But beneath that appearance of stability, the internal struggle Ross had described for years was continuing. During later psychological evaluations conducted after his arrest, Ross spoke about the cycle of urges he experienced. He described periods where he felt intense tension building inside him, a psychological pressure that seemed to grow stronger over time. Eventually, that pressure would lead him to search for a victim. Once the crime occurred, Ross said the tension would briefly disappear, but the relief was temporary. Soon the cycle would begin again. Experts who later studied the case noted that this pattern resembles compulsive behavior observed in certain violent offenders. The act itself becomes tied to the release of internal psychological pressure, creating a cycle that can repeat over time. Understanding this pattern helped investigators explain why Ross committed multiple crimes across several years. Yet the explanation did not make the reality any less disturbing. Ross had been aware that his thoughts were dangerous. He had even attempted to seek help at one point. But ultimately, he had continued down a path that led to devastating consequences for multiple victims and their families. For psychologists studying the case, Ross became an example of how complex the human mind can be and how difficult it can be to identify when troubling thoughts might turn into violent action at the same time. Prosecutors preparing for trial focused on a different aspect of Ross's behavior. They argued that despite any psychological struggles he may have experienced, Ross clearly understood what he was doing, that he had planned his actions, he had chosen isolated locations, that he had taken steps that allowed him to avoid detection for years. Those decisions, prosecutors believed, demonstrated awareness and responsibility as the legal process moved forward. These competing perspectives would play an important role in the courtroom. But outside the courtroom, another question continued to haunt the communities affected by the crimes. How had someone who appeared so ordinary managed to hide such darkness for so long? The answer, investigators believed, lay in the same quiet life Ross had used to conceal his actions. That he had lived among them, worked among them, driven the same roads they used every day, and for years, no one had known the truth. As the legal proceedings against Michael Ross began moving forward, the question of his psychological state became a central focus of the case. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, and psychological experts all approached this issue from different perspectives, each attempting to understand how Ross's mental condition might influence the outcome of the trial. For investigators, the facts of the case were already clear. Ross had provided detailed admissions connecting himself to multiple disappearances and violent crimes. His statements matched locations, timelines, and information that had been gathered during years of investigation. From a law enforcement standpoint, the evidence established a strong foundation for prosecution. But in the courtroom, understanding the actions of a defendant often goes beyond simply proving what happened. It also involves examining the mental state of the person responsible. This is where psychological experts became deeply involved in the case. Ross underwent extensive evaluations conducted by psychiatrists and psychologists who were tasked with studying his behavior, his history, and his understanding of the crimes he had committed. These evaluations involved long interviews, psychological testing, and detailed examination of Ross's personal background. Experts explored his childhood experiences, his emotional development, and the disturbing thoughts he had described during earlier interviews. One of the key questions facing the court was whether Ross suffered from a psychological condition that significantly impaired his ability to control his actions. Ross himself had described powerful urges that he struggled to resist. According to his own statements, he sometimes felt trapped in cycles of tension that eventually led him to seek out victims. For the defense, this description became part of their argument. They suggested that Ross's mental struggles had played a major role in the crimes, and that his psychological condition should be considered during sentencing. Psychiatrists who studied Ross identified traits associated with severe personality disorders. Some experts described patterns of compulsive behavior and deeply ingrained fantasies that had developed over many years. These characteristics, they explained, may have influenced his actions. However, the presence of psychological issues did not necessarily mean that Ross lacked responsibility for what he had done. That distinction became the central point of debate. Prosecutors argued that Ross clearly understood the nature of his actions and knew they were wrong. They pointed to the way he had selected isolated locations, approached victims in situations where they were vulnerable, and continued living a normal life afterward without revealing what he had done. These behaviors, prosecutors argued, demonstrated planning and awareness that in their view. Ross's ability to avoid detection for years showed that he understood the consequences of his actions and deliberately attempted to hide them. Psychological experts for the prosecution also noted that Ross had maintained control in many other areas of his life. He managed responsibilities within the family business, interacted with customers and colleagues, and navigated everyday situations without difficulty. This suggested that he was capable of making rational decisions. The courtroom debates surrounding these psychological questions were complex and often intense. Experts presented detailed analyses of Ross's behavior, while attorneys attempted to interpret those findings in ways that supported their arguments. For the families of the victims, these discussions were emotionally difficult to witness. While legal professionals debated diagnoses and behavioral patterns, the families were focused on a much more personal reality. They had lost daughters, sisters, and loved ones. For them, the most important question was not the exact psychological explanation for Ross's actions that it was whether justice would be served. The case drew widespread attention across Connecticut and beyond. News reports described the disturbing details that had emerged from the investigation and the shocking realization that a man who appeared so ordinary had been responsible for multiple violent crimes. Communities that had once felt safe were now confronting a painful truth. The predator responsible had lived among them, that he had traveled the same roads, that he had interacted with people who had no idea what he was capable of. This realization left a lasting impact on the region. Public discussions about safety became more common. Parents spoke more openly with their children about the risks of traveling alone. Hitchhiking, which had once been relatively common in rural areas, became far less frequent as people grew more cautious. Meanwhile, the courtroom process continued. Evidence was presented. Witnesses spoke. Experts explained their findings about Ross's mental state. Through it all, the central facts of the case remained unchanged. Ross had admitted to committing a series of violent crimes that had taken place over several years. The investigation had confirmed those admissions, and the legal system now faced the task of determining the consequences. For the families of the victims, the trial represented the culmination of a long and painful journey. Years earlier, their loved ones had disappeared without explanation. Now, the truth had emerged. The uncertainty that once defined their lives had been replaced by the painful clarity of what had happened. But justice, they hoped, would ensure that the crimes were not forgotten. As the legal proceedings moved closer to their conclusion, the case of Michael Ross was already becoming one of the most significant criminal cases in Connecticut's history. It had revealed how a serial offender could hide within ordinary life for years. That it had shown the challenges investigators face when crimes occur across multiple communities. And it had demonstrated the determination of detectives who refused to let the disappearances remain unsolved. Soon, the courtroom would deliver its final judgment. And with that judgment would come the next chapter in the story of the man known as the Eggman. Chapter 7. The Courtroom, the Victims, and Justice. As the legal case against Michael Ross moved toward trial, the quiet towns that had once struggled with unanswered disappearances were now confronting a very different reality. The man investigators had identified as responsible for multiple violent crimes was no longer an unknown predator moving silently through the region. He was now a defendant in one of the most closely watched criminal cases in Connecticut's history. The courtroom proceedings carried enormous weight for everyone involved. For prosecutors, the goal was to present a clear and compelling case that demonstrated Ross's responsibility for the crimes he had confessed to. For the defense, the challenge was to examine every detail of the investigation and raise questions about Ross's mental state and the circumstances surrounding his confessions. But beyond the legal arguments, there was another group whose presence shaped the atmosphere of the trial: the families of the victims. For years, these families had lived with uncertainty. The disappearances of their loved ones had left questions that lingered without answers. Now, sitting inside the courtroom, they were about to hear the details of what investigators had uncovered. The experience was emotionally overwhelming. Each day of testimony brought painful reminders of what had happened. Yet many families attended the proceedings because they wanted to witness the process of justice firsthand. The prosecution began presenting evidence that had been gathered during the investigation and the months following Ross's arrest. One of the most significant elements of the case was Ross's own admissions to investigators. During interviews with law enforcement, Ross had provided detailed descriptions of his encounters with several victims. These statements included information about locations, travel routes, and circumstances that closely matched evidence collected during earlier investigations. For prosecutors, these details were critical. They demonstrated that Ross possessed knowledge about the crimes that could only have come from someone directly involved. Investigators who had worked on the case took the stand to explain how the disappearances had been examined over the years. They described the early stages of the investigation when each case appeared separate and how the gradual sharing of information between departments eventually revealed a pattern. Maps were shown in court illustrating the locations where victims had last been seen. These maps highlighted the network of highways and rural roads connecting the towns involved in the case. For jurors, the visual representation helped explain how someone traveling regularly through the region could encounter multiple victims across different communities. Prosecutors also emphasized Ross's work within the family egg distribution business. The job required frequent driving across eastern Connecticut and neighboring areas. Deliveries to grocery stores and markets meant that Ross was often traveling along the same roads investigators had identified as central to the pattern of disappearances. This connection between Ross's daily routine and the geographic pattern of the crimes became one of the key elements of the prosecution's argument. But the trial was not only about maps and investigative reports. It was also about the victims. During the proceedings, the names and stories of the young women whose lives had been taken were shared with the court. Wendy Barabalt, Deborah Smith, Leslie Shelley, Tammy Rose, and others whose disappearances had once been mysteries that haunted their families. Witnesses described who these women were before the crimes occurred. They were students, friends, daughters, young people with plans for the future. Hearing these stories reminded everyone in the courtroom that the case was not simply about solving a criminal investigation. It was about lives that had been lost for the families. Sitting in the courtroom, these moments were especially emotional. Many had spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. Now, the trial was forcing them to confront the details of events they had once hoped might never have occurred. Yet despite the pain, many family members expressed determination to see the process through. They wanted the truth to be heard. They wanted the court to understand the impact of the crimes, and they wanted to ensure that the victims would not be forgotten. The defense team approached the case from a different angle. While acknowledging Ross's involvement in the crimes, defense attorneys focused heavily on the psychological evaluations that had been conducted after his arrest. They argued that Ross had struggled with severe psychological problems that influenced his behavior over many years. According to the defense, these mental health issues should be considered carefully when determining the appropriate legal outcome. Expert witnesses were called to discuss the psychological assessments performed on Ross. These experts explained the patterns of compulsive behavior Ross had described during interviews. They discussed the cycles of tension and release he claimed to experience and the troubling fantasies that had developed during his adolescence. The defense argued that these factors demonstrated the complexity of Ross's mental state, but prosecutors responded by emphasizing Ross's ability to plan and conceal his actions. They pointed out that Ross had chosen isolated locations, he had approached victims in situations where they were vulnerable, and he had continued living a normal life afterward, without revealing his actions to anyone. These behaviors, prosecutors argued, showed clear awareness and control. The courtroom debates between these two perspectives became one of the defining elements of the trial. On one side were arguments about psychological factors and mental health, that on the other side were arguments about responsibility, planning, and accountability. For the jurors listening to the evidence, the task ahead was incredibly serious. They would ultimately decide how the law should respond to the crimes Ross had committed. As the trial continued, more testimony and evidence would be presented. But one thing was already clear. The case of Michael Ross had revealed a disturbing truth about how a dangerous predator had operated for years within ordinary communities. And now, the courtroom was the place where that truth would lead to its final judgment. As the trial of Michael Ross continued, the courtroom became a place where years of investigation, testimony, and emotion converged. Every piece of evidence presented carried weight. Every statement from witnesses added another layer to the story that had unfolded across Connecticut's highways and towns. For the jurors seated in the courtroom, the responsibility before them was immense. They were being asked to examine the evidence carefully and determine how the law should respond to the crimes Ross had admitted committing. The prosecution continued building its case by reinforcing the key elements that had emerged during the investigation. Detectives described the steps that eventually led them to Ross. The years spent comparing missing person cases, the mapping of locations where victims had last been seen, and the gradual realization that a single offender might be responsible. Investigators also explained the significance of Ross's confessions. These statements had not only acknowledged his involvement in the crimes, but had also included specific details that aligned with evidence already known to law enforcement. Locations he described matched the areas where victims disappeared. The timeline he provided corresponded with the dates investigators had been studying for years. For prosecutors, these confirmations were critical. They demonstrated that Ross's admissions were not vague or accidental. They contained information that strongly connected him to the crimes. But the courtroom proceedings were not limited to investigative evidence. The emotional heart of the trial came from the families and friends of the victims. During the proceedings, the lives of the young women who had been lost were described in deeply personal ways. Family members spoke about the daughters they had raised, the dreams those young women had carried, and the painful absence that had shaped their lives since the disappearances. For many in the courtroom, these moments were the most powerful of the entire trial. They reminded everyone that behind the legal arguments and forensic details were real people whose lives had been taken far too soon. The defense team continued presenting arguments about Ross's mental state. Psychological experts testified about the evaluations conducted after his arrest, describing patterns of compulsive thinking and emotional disturbance that Ross had reported during interviews. According to these experts, Ross had struggled for many years with thoughts and urges he claimed to find difficult to control. The defense argued that these psychological issues should be considered carefully when determining Ross's sentence. They did not deny that the crimes had occurred. Instead, they focused on the question of how Ross's mental condition might influence the legal outcome. But prosecutors responded by emphasizing Ross's ability to plan and conceal his actions over a long period of time. They pointed to the way he approached victims in situations where they were isolated and vulnerable. They highlighted the fact that Ross had continued his normal life for years without revealing what he had done. These actions, prosecutors argued, showed awareness and deliberate decision-making. The courtroom debates between these two perspectives continued for days. Experts presented their findings. Attorneys questioned witnesses. Evidence was examined carefully by the jurors. Finally, the time came for closing arguments. This moment represented the final opportunity for both sides to address the jury directly. Prosecutors spoke about the years of investigation that had led to Ross's arrest and the evidence that confirmed his involvement in multiple violent crimes. They reminded jurors of the victims whose lives had been lost and the families who had waited years for justice. The defense, meanwhile, asked the jury to consider the complexity of Ross's psychological condition and the role it may have played in his actions. When the closing arguments ended, the jury began the process of deliberation. For the families of the victims sitting in the courtroom, the waiting was incredibly difficult. The outcome of the trial would determine how the legal system responded to the crimes that had changed their lives forever. Eventually, the jury returned with its decision. Michael Ross was found guilty. The verdict confirmed what investigators had already concluded, that Ross was responsible for the crimes that had haunted Connecticut communities for years. The next phase of the proceedings focused on sentencing. Because of the seriousness of the crimes, the court considered the most severe penalties available under the law. The sentencing decision would reflect both the scale of the crimes and the impact they had on the victims' families and communities. When the final judgment was announced, it marked the end of a long and difficult journey through the justice system. For investigators, the verdict represented the conclusion of years of work spent uncovering the truth. For the families of the victims, it brought a form of closure that had been delayed for far too long. Yet, even with the verdict delivered, the story of Michael Ross did not simply end in the courtroom. The case had already left a lasting impact on the communities where the crimes occurred. That IT had changed how people thought about safety along rural highways. IT had raised questions about how serial offenders can hide within ordinary life. And it had demonstrated the persistence required to solve complex investigations that stretch across years and multiple jurisdictions. The trial had delivered justice according to the law, but the legacy of the case would continue to shape conversations about crime, investigation, and community safety for many years to come. Chapter 8: Legacy of Darkness. The case that changed Connecticut. When the trial of Michael Ross finally concluded and the courtroom doors closed, many people across Connecticut felt a complicated mixture of emotions. There was relief that the man responsible for years of violence had been identified and held accountable. There was a sense of closure for investigators who had spent countless hours piecing together the truth behind a series of disappearances that had once seemed impossible to solve. But there was also a deeper realization. The crimes committed by Ross had changed the region in ways that would last far beyond the trial itself. For years before his arrest, the towns scattered across eastern Connecticut had believed themselves to be safe places where serious violence was rare. Quiet roads, small communities, and familiar neighbors created an environment where people felt comfortable traveling between towns without much concern. The discovery that a serial offender had been operating within that environment shattered that sense of security. Residents were forced to confront the reality that dangerous individuals do not always appear obviously threatening. Sometimes they live among ordinary people, blending into everyday life without raising suspicion. Michael Ross had done exactly that. He had worked within the family egg distribution business. He had driven the same highways as countless other residents. He had interacted with people who saw him simply as another member of the community. Yet behind that ordinary life, he had been responsible for a series of crimes that stretched across years and affected multiple families. The realization left a lasting impression on communities throughout the region. Parents became more cautious about how their children traveled between towns. Conversations about personal safety became more common in schools and households. The practice of hitchhiking, which had once been relatively common along certain rural highways, began to disappear almost entirely. People who once thought nothing of accepting rides from strangers now understood how dangerous such situations could be. The investigation itself also left an important legacy within law enforcement. One of the key challenges investigators faced during the early years of the case was the difficulty of connecting separate disappearances that occurred in different towns. At the time, information sharing between police departments was not as immediate or centralized as it would later become. Each department handled its own cases, and it often took time before detectives began comparing notes with investigators in neighboring jurisdictions. The Michael Ross case demonstrated how critical cooperation between agencies could be when dealing with crimes that crossed geographic boundaries. In the years following the investigation, law enforcement agencies across many regions began placing greater emphasis on sharing information about missing persons and violent crimes. Improved communication systems and databases made it easier for investigators to identify patterns that might otherwise remain hidden. These changes were not the result of a single case alone, but the Ross investigation contributed to a broader awareness of how serial offenders can operate across multiple communities. For the families of the victims, however, the legacy of the case was far more personal. Long before investigators had identified Ross, those families had lived through years of uncertainty. Their daughters, sisters, and loved ones had disappeared without explanation. For a long time, they did not know whether the victims were alive or what had happened to them. That uncertainty created a kind of emotional limbo that is difficult to describe. When Ross's confessions finally revealed the truth, those families were faced with painful confirmation of the losses they had feared. Yet many family members also expressed relief that the mystery had finally been solved. The truth, even when it is difficult, can bring a form of closure that uncertainty never allows. Over time, some families chose to speak publicly about their loved ones, sharing memories of who they were before the crimes occurred. They wanted people to remember the victims not only for the tragedy that ended their lives, but also for the lives they had lived. Students, friends, young women with dreams and plans for the future. Remembering those lives became an important part of ensuring that the victims were not reduced simply to names within a criminal case. Meanwhile, the story of Michael Ross continued to draw attention from criminologists and psychologists who studied serial offenders. Experts examined the case in an effort to understand how someone who appeared outwardly ordinary could maintain such a hidden life for so many years. They studied Ross's psychological evaluations, his personal history, and the patterns investigators had identified during the investigation. These analyses contributed to broader research about how violent offenders operate and how law enforcement might detect similar patterns earlier in future cases. But even with that research, many questions about the human mind remain difficult to answer. Why do some individuals develop destructive impulses that others never experience? Why do some people act on those impulses while others seek help or find ways to control them? The case of Michael Ross offered insights, but it did not provide simple answers. For the communities affected by the crimes, The most important lesson was perhaps the importance of awareness, the understanding that safety cannot always be assumed, the recognition that vigilance and communication are essential in protecting communities from those who may seek to harm others. In the years after the trial, life in Connecticut gradually returned to a sense of normalcy. Towns continued to grow. Students continued attending universities across the region. Highways once again carried the steady movement of travelers and workers moving between communities. But the memory of the case remained a reminder of how quickly the appearance of safety can change, and a reminder of the determination required to uncover the truth when darkness hides behind an ordinary face. In the years that followed the conviction of Michael Ross, the case remained one of the most significant criminal investigations in Connecticut's history. The crimes themselves had already left a deep scar across several communities, but the long legal process that followed would continue to keep the case in public discussion for many years. For investigators and legal experts, the Ross case became a study in persistence. The investigation had taken years to unfold. Detectives had spent countless hours reviewing missing person reports, comparing locations, and searching for connections that were not immediately visible. At first, the disappearances seemed unrelated. Different towns, different circumstances, different timelines. But through careful analysis and cooperation between agencies, investigators had eventually discovered the pattern that led them to Ross. That effort demonstrated how solving complex cases often requires patience and collaboration. Rarely does the full picture appear all at once. Instead, it emerges gradually as small pieces of information begin to align. In many ways, the investigation served as a reminder of how determined investigators must remain when confronting crimes that stretch across years and jurisdictions. Yet for the families of the victims, the story was never simply about investigation techniques or legal procedures. It was about the lives that had been lost. Each victim had once been a young woman with hopes, friendships, and plans for the future. Their families continued remembering them not as victims defined by tragedy, but as individuals whose lives had meaning long before the crimes occurred. Over time, memorials and personal tributes became ways for families and communities to honor those memories. These moments of remembrance were deeply important. They shifted the focus away from the offender and back toward the people whose lives had been taken. Because while criminal cases often become associated with the names of those who committed the crimes, the true story belongs to the individuals whose lives were affected by them. For communities across eastern Connecticut, the memory of the case also brought lasting changes in how people approach safety. In earlier decades, hitchhiking had been seen by many as a normal part of travel, especially for students and young people moving between towns. After the Ross case, that perception changed dramatically. Parents warned their children about the dangers of accepting rides from strangers. Universities began placing greater emphasis on campus safety programs. Public awareness about personal security grew stronger throughout the region. These changes reflected a broader shift that occurred across many parts of the United States during the late 20th century. High-profile criminal cases often lead communities to re-examine assumptions about safety and trust. The Michael Ross investigation became one of those cases. For criminologists and psychologists, the case also provided an opportunity to examine the psychological patterns associated with serial offenders. Researchers studied Ross's history, the cycle of behavior he described during interviews, and the methods he used to approach victims. These studies contributed to a growing body of knowledge about how certain offenders operate, knowledge that can help investigators recognize warning signs earlier in future cases. However, experts are careful to emphasize that understanding these patterns does not always make prevention simple. Human behavior remains incredibly complex. While certain risk factors and behavioral indicators may appear in some offenders, many people with similar backgrounds never commit crimes at all. The challenge lies in identifying the rare situations where troubling patterns may lead to dangerous outcomes. The Ross case highlighted how difficult that task can be. Despite years of troubling internal struggles that Ross later described, those around him saw little reason to suspect the violent behavior he had concealed. He worked within the family business. He drove through communities as part of everyday routines. He interacted with people who had no idea what he was capable of. That contrast between ordinary appearance and hidden actions remains one of the most unsettling aspects of the story. It reminds us that the people responsible for serious crimes are not always strangers standing outside society. Sometimes they are individuals who move quietly within it. For investigators who worked the case, the eventual resolution brought a sense of closure. The years of unanswered questions had finally ended. The disappearances that once seemed mysterious had been explained, and the man responsible had been brought before the justice system. But even after the legal process concluded, the memory of the investigation remained part of the region's history. Stories about the case continued appearing in documentaries, books, and discussions about criminal justice. Each retelling served as a reminder of both the tragedy that occurred and the determination required to uncover the truth. Today, the quiet highways of eastern Connecticut look much the same as they did decades ago. Cars pass through small towns. Students travel between campuses. Families live their lives in communities surrounded by forests and farmland. The landscape itself has not changed, but the memory of what happened along those roads remains part of the region's collective awareness. That it is a reminder that vigilance matters, that communities must look out for one another, and that even the most carefully hidden crimes can eventually be uncovered through patience, cooperation, and the relentless pursuit of truth. The story of Michael Ross, the man once known as the Eggman, stands as a powerful example of both darkness and determination. Darkness in the crimes that occurred, and determination in the investigation that finally brought the truth to light. But above all, the lasting memory belongs to the victims whose lives were taken. Their stories continue to be remembered, and through that remembrance, the communities affected by the case continue honoring the lives that should never have been lost.